Second scripture lesson today comes from Luke chapter 5, the first 11 verses. I invite you to hear this, the word of the Lord. Once while Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." So they had done this. When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Almost 38 years ago, I started in ministry at the first congregation I served, a small congregation in a little village in central Pennsylvania, about 40 miles south of State College, which meant I was serving a congregation that was in the orbit of Penn State University. If you know anything about that part of Pennsylvania, it is in the midst of the mountains. Although there are no true mountains in Pennsylvania, there are ridges and valleys and oftentimes a creek or a river. The one flowing through the valley I was in was the Juniata River, which basically was flowing in a northeasterly direction through that valley on its way to the Susquehanna River and eventually Harrisburg and then the Chesapeake Bay. So I arrived in this community in 1981, and as you do when you come to the new church, you begin to learn the things that the congregation does. Things that people do for a living, things that people do for fun. And I found out there were basically 5 things that people in that community did for recreation. They went hunting. That was a big one. They went fishing. They went hunting. They played golf. And what was the 5th one? Oh yeah, they went hunting. A lot of hunting. I only took up 2 of those 3, golf and fishing. And for me, they were pretty similar, because when I went playing golf, I usually found water, and then I had to fish my ball out. So the 2 are very, very similar. But I learned to fish from a couple of gentlemen in the congregation. One was the head biologist for the Pennsylvania Fish Commission. He had a really interesting license that the Fish Commission issued him. It had a whole bunch of zeros followed by the number 3. It meant he was the number 3 person in the pecking order in that agency. And I used to go with him all over central Pennsylvania fishing in all times of the year. Even this time of the year, we would fish through the ice for fish and usually would catch lots of fish. In fact, this person was so good at fishing, I think he probably could have caught fish out of a mud puddle. Which kind of leads to this story, which I may have heard from him originally. The story of a gentleman who was having success fishing in a time and a place when people were just not catching fish, yet this gentleman was. And so people were naturally curious, how was he having the success he had when nobody else seemed to be catching anything? Was it a special lure that he was using? Was he using one of those spray products that they sell on fishing shows, that supposedly make the lure more attractive to the fish? I don't know how that works, because you're going to spray your lure and throw it in the water. Doesn't that wash it off? I don't know. Was it the color? Was it some sort of action that he was doing? Had he found a particular hot spot that nobody else knew about? So everybody wanted to know, and he was very tight-lipped about his success. Well, this attracted the attention of the Fish Commission, the fish warden. He made arrangements to go fishing with this gentleman. So they motored out in the middle of a lake, and the fish warden casts his rod, casts his lure out and starts retrieving it. The other person doesn't. He reaches into a box on the floor of the boat and he pulls out a stick of dynamite. He lights the dynamite and tosses it in the water, and it explodes and stuns the fish, and they come all floating up to the surface, and he scoops up the bigger ones. And the fish warden says, you can't do that. That's not sporting, for one, and it's illegal for two. So the man lights another stick of dynamite. He hands it to the fish warden. He says, well, what are you going to do? Talk or fish? I remember going out with one of the other gentlemen. He was one who preferred to fish in the river, and we were after a type of fish called muskies, which were really big. And from the way they were described to me, they fought hard, and you had to watch out when they came in the boat because they were like 90% teeth. I don't know, because I never saw one. You know, he used to tell me you had to cast 1,000 times before you even would get a nibble. Well, one time we were floating down the Juniata River, and I cast my lure out. It was one of these bottom-running lures. You scouts probably know all of this. You probably have about 5 merit badges for fishing or something like that, you know, or making fire with 2 sticks, you know, things like that. I was a scout for like 2 years, and then scouting kind of went away in my community. Unfortunate. You're fortunate to have your program. Well, I did everything wrong. I cast the lure upstream. You don't do that, because if it gets caught behind a rock, then you got to paddle the boat upstream so you can get your lure out. You cast downstream, because if it gets caught, you can just float down, and as you float past it, you can get the lure out and just continue to fish. Well, so I did everything wrong. I cast upstream, and almost immediately a fish hits it. And it hits it so hard that it jerked the reel off of my rod, which I was able to grab and hold with one hand while I worked to retrieve the fish. And I fought for a little while, and the guy wondered what I had on. He wondered if it was a muskie. You know, could it be that I lucked into one? Well, we landed the fish, and he started to laugh. He was just roaring with laughter because it was a carp. 32 inches long. I have never come close to catching a fish that large, and it was a carp, which are next to worthless. In fact, one of the things that experience taught me, it gave me a good recipe for cooking carp. Apparently what you do is you nail the fish to one of those wooden roofing shingles, and you toss it up on the roof. And a week later, you take it down off the roof, you throw the carp away and eat the shingle. The point is, I did everything that you shouldn't do and caught the biggest fish of my life. I wonder if Jesus ever went fishing. You know, we don't know that Jesus went fishing or not. In fact, we know surprisingly little about his life growing up in Nazareth. We know all those stories from when Jesus was born in Bethlehem. It's only been less than 2 months since we reviewed all of that during the Advent and Christmas season. And there's that story in the Gospel of Luke when Jesus visits the temple at age 12. We know that one. But everything else is silent until he appears on the scene of Galilee, preaching and healing and doing other miraculous deeds, much like John the Baptist before him. We assume that maybe Jesus apprenticed as a carpenter. That's what Joseph did. So the assumption is that Jesus must have done similar, but even that we don't know. Did he ever just grab a pole and a line and go to the Sea of Galilee and fish just for the fun of it? We don't know. But what we do know from what Jesus tells Peter and the others to do after he teaches on the shore of the, calls it Lake Gennesaret, that's the Greek name for the Sea of Galilee. We do know that he told them, let's go out into the deep water, let the nets down and do some fishing. You see, it was pretty much a standard day on the shore of the Sea of Galilee when Jesus shows up with crowds following him, as they often did. And in order to get a little bit of space between the press of the crowds and his ability to teach them, Jesus gets into Peter's boat and pushes out a little bit from shore. It gives him some space and also gives him the natural amplification of the lake to make his voice easier to be heard. And meanwhile, Peter and Andrew, his brother, who's not mentioned in the Luke passage, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and we should assume also from the parallels, their fathers, are up on shore after having fished all night and caught nothing. They're up on shore cleaning their nets and repairing any rips and doing all the things that needed to be done so that when nightfall came, they could go back out again and fish. That was their way of making a living. But Jesus, after teaching the people, says to Simon, let's put out into the deep water and you let down your nets for a catch. Now, Peter is an experienced fisherman, and he knows that everything Jesus is just telling him to do is wrong. It's not the right time of the day. It's the middle of the day. They fished at night. It's not the right location for fishing. They fished at night because the fish came into the shore for feeding, and they were easier to catch because the water was shallower. Out in the deeper water, the fish would be down lower in order to be cooler, and their nets simply wouldn't get down that far. But not only would they have to let their nets down and do this fruitless fishing, which is what Peter's assuming, after they were done, they'd have to come back into shore and repeat all over the cleaning and repairing, because they would have caught something, probably what we used to call salad, seaweed and stuff like that, and maybe drug the nets against some underwater obstruction that caused a rip. So they'd have to do all of what they had just completed over again and then catch a little bit of sleep before they went out the next night in order to fish, which was the way they made their living. So you see that little bit of suggestion in what Peter says. You know, we just fished all night when you're supposed to fish, and we caught nothing. How do you think it's going to be any different in the middle of the day? Reading between the lines. But then Peter says, but Master, because you say so, we'll do it. We'll let down the nets. You see, this wasn't the first time that Peter and the other disciples had encountered Jesus. Jesus had been active throughout the region, teaching and healing and so forth. And it's hard sometimes to make a harmony out of the Gospels. There's other times when Jesus comes into contact with Peter, his brother, and his partners. There's one story where Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. Did this happen before or after? It's, again, hard to pin it down. One thing that commentators do discuss is whether healing Peter's mother-in-law was a positive or negative act. They're kind of divided on that. But Peter says, because you say so, we'll do it. And he lets down the nets and has one of the biggest surprises of his life up to that point. For he begins to catch so many fish that the nets are strained and begin to break. And they're offloading so many fish into the boat that their boat begins to sink. And they motion for the other boat to come over and help them. And they load fish into that boat and it begins to be swamped. This was wholly impossible. And yet the evidence was right before them. This was against all of the rules of fishing. All of the experience that they had told them that this shouldn't be, yet they were having this miraculous catch of fish. And Peter's response is interesting because it's very similar to the response of Isaiah when God calls Isaiah. Peter says, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Isaiah says, "I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in the midst of people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, my eyes have seen the Lord." Similar response in both situations, although Isaiah's was interesting because he talks about that whole problem of unclean lips, and one of the seraphs flies over to the altar and with tongs takes out a hot coal and then brings it back to Isaiah and touches his lips with that. I'm guessing at that point, Isaiah's pulling out his smartphone and he's making a note to himself, don't bring up the unclean lips thing again. But Peter is completely astonished. And instead of the deferential master that he uses the first time, which simply means teacher, now it's Lord. Get away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man. The covenant name of God. Peter recognizes that everything that he's been seeing adds up to something different. And so they return to shore with their catch of fish, and they bring everything up on shore, and they probably get started on doing the net thing when Jesus says, fear not, from now on you will catch people instead of fish. And we're told that the disciples immediately left everything on the shore with their fathers, assumedly, and left to follow Jesus. And this would be the last time that Jesus needed to make that invitation. They followed him wholly from that point moving forward. And we recognize that there is something in this that speaks to our calling as well. So we recognize that when we become a member of Christ's church, we are responding to the call of Jesus Christ to follow him, just like Peter, Andrew, James, and John were doing. Just like Isaiah was doing and became one of the greatest Old Testament prophets. We are following the call of Jesus Christ to be witnesses for Christ. As Peter later would say, set apart Christ in your hearts as Lord. And always be prepared to give a reason to anyone who asks for the hope that you have in your hearts. This is what we are called to do as well, to be ready to give a reason for why we have that hope. Those who write books and articles about church growth like to point out what survey after survey consistently says. When people are asked, why did you come to the church that you're now a member of? More times than not, we're talking 75 to 80% of the time, the response that people give is, somebody in the church invited me to come. One of the members of the congregation asked me to come with them to worship. It's not, I came because of the pastor. It's not, I came because they have this great program. It's not, I came because they gave me food when I needed food. It's not that they came because they have this mission outreach, and I think that's an important thing to be involved in. Those are all great. Those are all important. Those are all necessary to keep people engaged in your congregation. But getting them there the first time, that's all of our job. I mean, look at another story in the Gospels. Jesus speaks to a tax collector, Levi, and almost the next verse, here's Jesus with a whole bunch of tax collectors eating in Levi's home. How did that happen? Levi invited them to come and find in Jesus what he had found in the Lord. Our calling is to do the same. And that calling comes to you at a time when you're starting a pastoral transition. Maynard's last Sunday was last Sunday. His last day was Thursday. I was with him for that day. We did a service over at the Westminster Towers, and we had to do it 3 times, once in the chapel, once in the health center, and once in the independent living center. And each time that Maynard was introduced, Brenda Loyal, the chaplain at Westminster Towers, introduced him as pastor of Grace Covenant Presbyterian Church, but he's retiring tomorrow. One of the things the presbytery likes me to do is to come to a congregation where a pastor has just left as soon as I possibly can and declare the pulpit to be vacant. I never have liked that term, the pulpit to be vacant. This pulpit's not vacant. I'm here today. Candy's always here. Other pastors will be here. Eventually you'll have an interim to provide regular pastoral services until you get a search committee together and you conduct a search and you find your next installed pastor. And the good news about that next installed pastor is God already knows who that is. God's already been preparing that person for the ministry that that person will provide to you here through life's experiences, through a response to a call, much like Peter and Andrew and James and John were once called. So you're embarking on a mission of discovery where you will eventually discover who it is that God has been preparing to be your next pastor, and you will embark on writing a new chapter in your history with that person leading you. But as you move through this time of transition, I would encourage you to respond much like the disciples responded when Jesus called them by the Sea of Galilee. When Jesus said, "Come and follow me, you will now fish for people," the disciples laid down their nets immediately and followed him. What nets do you need to lay down in order to follow Jesus more closely, as individuals or as a congregation? Soon you'll have an interim pastor. I know you had a committee working diligently to find that person. And that person will help you answer questions like that. That person will help you assess your history. Where have you been? Where are you headed? What are the things that are working well that you need to hold on to? What are the things you're doing that maybe you need to let go of, like nets laid down on the lakeshore? Are there new things that you would dare to try, dare to do? At the very least, the interim will help you consider questions like this and get you to a position where you can implement them. And if it's something new that you want to try, that'll be helpful information for the committee that will search for your next pastor. You can look for somebody that has the gifts to help you do those things. So there's a whole number of tasks that need to be accomplished so that you can be in the best possible position you can be to call that next pastor. And really, it depends on all of you to pull together and to help move the ministry of this church forward. It may mean your deacons may have to make a few more calls for the time being until that interim shows up. Your elders may have to take a little bit more added responsibility. Each member may have to do a few things that ordinarily you wouldn't be doing. But it's all part and parcel of us pulling together and responding to the call of Jesus Christ in our lives. And I'm confident that you folks will continue to do that here at Grace Covenant. For again, it is a mission of discovery. And if we are faithful to the God who calls us, we know that when we cast our nets into the waters, that we will be successful in that endeavor. May God bless us as we seek to be faithful to God's calling in our lives. Amen.